The season was supposed to be over. The equipment was being prepped for shutdown, the weather was closing in, and every person on that boat had already mentally packed up and gone home. But Emily Riedel wasn't ready to walk away, not yet. Something was pulling her back to the water, something she couldn't explain to the crew, something that didn't show up on a standard report but flickered in her gut every time she looked at the sonar screen. That instinct, that refusal to ignore what the numbers were quietly whispering, led to one of the most extraordinary finds ever recorded in the history of Alaskan gold dredging. What they pulled up from the bottom of that freezing inlet wasn't just gold. It was history, and it had been waiting down there for over 80 years for someone stubborn enough to come looking. This is the story of Emily Riedel's final dive of the season, and why it changed everything. To understand what made this discovery so remarkable, you first have to understand the kind of work Emily and her crew do every season. Gold dredging in the waters off Nome, Alaska is not glamorous. It is cold, physical, dangerous, and brutally uncertain. The Bering Sea doesn't offer comfort or patience. Crews operate within tight permit windows, dealing with unpredictable tides, equipment failures, and the constant pressure to produce enough gold to make the season financially viable. Most of what comes up in the sluice box is fine black sand, trace color, maybe a few ounces if you're in the right spot. A truly great week might yield something worth celebrating. A truly great season is rare. What Emily found at the end of this particular season wasn't just rare. It was unprecedented. The season had already stretched into uncomfortable territory. The Erica's pump systems were showing wear, the dredge frame had taken damage in a recent storm, and the crew was exhausted in the particular bone-deep way that only comes from weeks of offshore work in sub-freezing conditions. Every practical reason pointed toward wrapping up, winterizing the gear, filing the final logs, heading for shore. But Emily had been staring at a set of sonar readings from the previous day that she couldn't stop thinking about. Most of the team had looked at the data and seen what they expected to see: bedrock, dense return, nothing unusual. Emily looked at the same numbers and saw something else. The signal was too clean, too flat, too uniform across too wide an area. Natural rock formations at that depth don't behave that way. She had spent enough time reading underwater data to know when something didn't fit the pattern. She called the team together and told them they were going back out. One more dive. Nobody was thrilled. The pumps were barely holding, the weather forecast wasn't friendly, and the location she wanted to check, a grid coordinate they'd been calling Point Delta, at the outer edge of their claim, was in a section of the trench they'd largely written off. It had shown inconsistent returns all season, the kind of reading that usually means you're wasting time. Emily didn't see it that way. She marked the coordinates herself, gave the order to prep the suction lines for a single focus pass, and suited up before anyone could talk her out of it. The water was rough on the descent. Visibility was poor, close to nothing past a few feet. Emily relied entirely on her handheld sonar to navigate, following the edge of the trench as it opened up below her. Most of what she passed was familiar: silt, broken shale, scattered gravel, the kind of seafloor that tells you nothing useful. Then the device in her hand changed its tone. The feedback shifted, sharpened, buzzed with the distinct signature of dense metal. She swept the sensor again. Same response. She dropped lower. What she found was a shape in the sediment that had no business being there. A rectangular mass, roughly 10 feet in length, buried under multiple layers of compacted gravel. She pressed her gloved hand into the sand at its edge and felt a surface that was smooth, cold in a different way than the sea flew around it, and entirely artificial. When she cleared away a small section of sediment and directed her light at it, something caught the beam and threw it back. A glint. Faint, but unmistakable. That was metal, and it had been sitting there undisturbed for a very long time. She attached a weighted marker buoy to the site and surfaced. Back on deck, she gave the crew a precise, calm account of what she'd seen, and ordered the dredge to begin suction at low speed, centered on her marker. The pump ran. Debris came through, and then the sluice box caught something that didn't sound like gravel. It sounded heavy, dense, wrong in the best possible way. When they hauled the object onto the deck, it took a moment for anyone to process what they were looking at. It was a thick metallic plate, roughly the shape of a large floor tile, its corners worn smooth by corrosion, its surface covered in a dark crust of mineral buildup. Emily got down close and started scraping. Underneath the grime, a dull golden tone appeared, Not bright, not shiny, but the muted, rich color of refined metal that had spent decades underwater. She called for a testing kit. The result came back quickly. Nearly 98% purity, with a chemical composition matching mid-20th century minting standards. Along one edge of the plate, barely legible through the corrosion, were stamped letters in Latin. The crew had gone completely quiet. Nobody spoke. They just watched Emily work through what she was seeing, reading the surface of the plate, running the numbers in her head, connecting the dots from the sonar data, the depth, the location, the alloy composition, and the stamp text. She didn't offer any theories out loud. She just said, "Keep the line running. Same position. Don't widen the sweep." What came up next confirmed that they were not looking at a stray artifact. The dredge began surfacing solid returns in steady succession. Flat, rectangular, dense. Gold bars. Not dust, not nuggets, not trace color in fine black sand. Actual cast bars, each one roughly 40 pounds, each one marked with uniform serial stamps across its surface. Some had fused together from decades of pressure and salt exposure. Others came up perfectly intact. The deck was filling with a kind of cargo that none of them had ever seen before, and most of them couldn't fully believe was real. Emily ordered a temporary halt to record and photograph everything before the next lift. She took measurements, logged serial numbers, and ran further alloy tests using the boat's onboard spectrometer. The purity readings came back even higher on subsequent bars, above 99%. The trace elements in the alloy were consistent with wartime transport preservation techniques, chemical stabilizers added to gold shipments specifically to protect them from oxidation during extended sea transit. Whoever had loaded this cargo had not been planning to retrieve it quickly. They had packed it to last. At some point during the documentation process, the suction line had been pulling from a section of the trench where the seafloor gave way to something larger. The sonar was now showing a continuous structural outline in the sediment, a long, curved shape that stretched beyond the visible range of the sensor. Wood, darkened almost to black by decades of submersion, but intact, preserved by the cold water, the low oxygen levels at depth, and the thick silt that had slowly buried it. Iron reinforcement bands still clung to the structure's sides. This wasn't debris. This was a vessel, or what remained of one. Emily repositioned the crane rig and prepared for a deeper look. When the lift lines caught the edge of the main structure and began applying tension, the weight sensors spiked immediately. Whatever was inside was far heavier than the crate they had already recovered. The winch strained as the structure broke free from the trench floor. Midway through the ascent, one corner of the old frame cracked open under the pressure, and a second cluster of bars spilled out, landing on the deck with a series of metallic thuds that nobody who heard them will ever forget. Emily picked up one of the loose bars and turned it in the light. The text stamped across its face was partially eroded but legible. U.S. Army Transport, 1942. She put it down carefully. She didn't say anything. She asked for the camera and started filming every bar, every surface, every serial number she could find. Back inside the cabin, she began cross-referencing the serial sequences against military archive databases on her tablet. The process took time, inputting the numbers by hand and working through fragmented records that hadn't been digitized cleanly. But a match appeared. The numbers corresponded to a documented wartime manifest from 1942, a cargo listing under the designation Operation Cindervault. The shipment was described as classified Federal Reserves, gold bullion intended for secure transfer northward through Anchorage as part of wartime financial stabilization measures. The vessel assigned to carry it was named the Aurora's Hope. It had departed on schedule and then simply ceased to exist in the record. No distress signal. No wreck report. No debris. Just a notation that it had gone missing at sea, followed by bureaucratic silence that had lasted over 80 years. The last recorded coordinates of the Aurora's Hope placed it within a few nautical miles of Point Delta. Emily sat with that information for a long moment. She was not just sitting on top of a gold deposit. She was anchored directly above a lost wartime transport vessel, carrying Federal Reserves that the United States government had written off decades ago and apparently never attempted to locate. The implications of that extended in multiple directions she wasn't prepared to fully process yet. So she did what she always does when the situation gets complicated. She focused on the work. "We continue at first light," she told the crew. "Same parameters. Same spot. The next dive went deeper. Emily descended with reinforced equipment, following the contour of the trench to where the sonar showed the greatest concentration of metallic return. The debris field was extensive: hull plating, bronze fittings, structural beams, scattered fragments of the ship's framing, all spread across roughly 40 meters of seafloor. Inside a partially intact section of the hull, she found what she had been looking for: a sealed compartment, its original air pocket still holding pressure, its contents stacked in organized rows exactly as they had been loaded before the ship went down. Rectangular containers, metallic, sealed, untouched. She tapped one with her tool and heard the hollow ring of a pressurized interior echo back through the water. She activated her locator beacon, locked the frequency to the hull, recorded a final scan, and ascended. When she broke the surface and the crew helped her onto the deck, she said 4 words: "We found the ship." What followed was not a celebration. The find was too large, too serious, too loaded with legal and historical weight for anyone to process it as a simple win. Emily continued documenting, continued logging, continued building the most thorough record she could of everything they had found and where they had found it. She understood that the moment word got out, and it would get out, the situation would move beyond her control quickly. She was right. Within days, a Coast Guard aircraft appeared overhead and requested their coordinates. A cutter arrived on the horizon, moving at pace. Uniformed officers boarded with clear authority, citing maritime salvage law and federal security protocols. They documented the recovered cargo, photographed every bar, cross-referenced the serial numbers against records none of the crew were permitted to see, and began loading everything into sealed, marked containers. A helicopter brought 2 additional individuals in civilian clothes who spoke only to the commanding officer and directed that the entire recovered hull be placed under restricted classification. Within hours, the gold was gone. The sediment samples were gone. The dredge data logs had been copied and the originals confiscated. The recovery zone around Point Delta was declared a restricted area. Emily asked for documentation of the seizure. She was told the matter involved national security and would be handled in Washington. Every crew member was interviewed separately on deck and instructed to maintain silence pending legal review of salvage rights and ownership determination. No official paperwork was left behind. Maritime records reflected nothing. The cutter departed at dusk carrying approximately $90 million in wartime gold bullion, and the only evidence left on the Erica was a faint shimmer of gold dust on Emily's gloves and the impression marks left on the deck where the bars had been stacked. That night, Emily wrote one line in her personal log: "The vault is still down there. What they took wasn't all of it." She was right about that too. In the weeks that followed, reports trickled in from other people working in the region: divers, fishermen, sonar technicians. Military submersibles had been observed returning to the trench at night. Floodlights had been seen cutting across the frozen inlet at hours when no public operations were scheduled. A former colleague of Emily's who worked freelance on underwater mapping projects managed to send her encrypted sonar files from the area. The data showed multiple additional anomalies beneath the main wreck site: 3 distinct metallic pockets buried deeper than anything she had reached, each showing density signatures consistent with intact gold bullion. The federal recovery had addressed the surface layer. The deeper chambers remained untouched. Emily commissioned private laboratory analysis of the residue collected from her dredge equipment before the seizure. The results confirmed microscopic gold fragments chemically identical to mid-20th century Federal Reserve material, along with bronze particles consistent with period marine fittings. Combined with the encrypted sonar data, her own dive records, and the documented serial numbers, she built what may be the most thorough independent account of the wreck ever assembled. Her calculations, based on sonar density readings and known cargo distribution patterns from the original manifest, suggested that the gold recovered and removed represented only a fraction of the Aurora's Hope's total payload. The remaining cargo, deeper, better preserved, sealed in the lower chambers that had not yet been accessed, could dwarf the initial recovery by a significant multiple. The permits were expired. The site was federally restricted. The season was over. But Emily had already done something the government's swift intervention could not undo.